All right, you fucking YouTube nerds. Here we are. We are looking at brand new guitar amp heads that are between the price range of $500 and $1,000. And we're on Musician's Friend right now, but this isn't specific only to Musician's Friend. I chose Musician's Friend for this video only because they also coincide with Guitar Center. So it's like looking at two stores in one. One thing I'll mention is that Sweetwater does have one other option that you'll see that Musician's Friend doesn't have, and I'll list it when we get closer to that price range for that amp. But just right off the bat, I always recommend if you're not looking at a modeling amp or a solid state amp right now in today's economy, if you're looking at only tube amps, I highly recommend either a Condition 1 open box or brand new. Normally, buying used makes sense because you can usually find used gear for cheaper. A prime example would be, a PV6505 Plus or an EVH 5150 Mark III. And normally, back in the day, I say back in the day, but 5 years ago, 10 years ago, so you could get a used one of those for $600, you know, or at least somewhere between 5 and 600, and it wasn't uncommon to get that, which isn't a big deal because at that price point and with the cost of tubes 5 to 10 years ago, they were cheap enough where if you bought something used and it needed new tubes, it wasn't a big deal. It wasn't a huge chunk out of your wallet. Nowadays it is. And I can't imagine for the life of me someone paying, or me in particular, I couldn't imagine for the life of me paying $800-900 for a used amp and getting that amp and finding out that it needs new tubes. Because if you buy something used, those tubes aren't covered. So you can't call up the place or call up the person that sold you the amp as a used amp and say, "Hey, these tubes are bad. Give me some new tubes," because they're going to say, "Well, you bought a used amp. Of course, there's always that risk of needing new tubes, and that's always a possibility." So right now, it doesn't make sense to buy a used amp for $800-900 and then spend another $300 on tubes. Plus, if you're not a guitar tech, you also got to pay a little bit of money to have those new tubes properly biased. It doesn't make sense. So now that that $900 used amp that you got, you thought you were saving a ton of money. Now all of a sudden you have to spend another 300-400 for new tubes, depending on how many tubes are in the amp. As far as starting off with a list here, if we're looking at mainly metal, and I don't mean just metal core or death metal or anything, but I mean just a good solid metal tone amp wise. Boss Katana, really good. This is the newest Katana Artist series that has a little more functionality, a little more practicality to it compared to the regular MK2 Katana. I'll be honest, I have not personally tried this amp, but I have heard a couple people play it at a store 2 weeks ago, and it actually sounded really good. I can't even, I've never really liked the Boss Katana series, but when I heard a guy rocking out in this thing, I actually thought it was pretty good. It was really good. I mean, the main differences here between most modeling and solid state amps compared to a tube amp is really about feel and in the room, in person sound. So it's not something that you can really notice. You'll never notice the difference between solid state modeling and tube amps over a video ever. And that's a fact. It's not even opinion at this point. It's been proven many different ways. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm biased against one or the other. I love tube amps, but I also love recording with modeling amps because that's what they're great for. Modeling amps are great for recording with, and you would never know the difference. Let's see. Going down the line. Okay, I already did the review of the Blackstar Silverline head, Silverline Deluxe head. Good amp. It's definitely a little more mid-scooped compared to the Boss. If you're kind of going back and forth between the Katana head and the Silverline head, they're both really good, but it just depends on, do you want more of a mid scoop sound from the Silverline, or do you want a more airy, I guess, yeah, airy sound that you can get from the Katana? Those are the only differences. Um, the other only difference I could say is, I'll say there's two differences. There's that, and then the fact that you can, select different tube amp response sounds from Silverline, which is good. But like I said, I'm not a I would have no problem buying an open box or used model of a modeling amp, because you don't have to worry about tubes. I mean, if you take a look at the thing you're buying and you can tell it wasn't sitting around on a basement floor covered in dust for 2 years, then you shouldn't have a problem with it. EVH LBX, they are a complete toss up. I say that because they do use those smaller tubes. For 649, at that point, I would look for a used one, because you could probably find one for about $400. And the good thing about EL84 tubes, they're still cheap enough where if you buy a used amp, replacing them is not a big deal. Randall. Okay, Randall, I've never liked the sound of Randall. I know that they are reliable workhorses. They are good amps overall. Some people love the sound of them. Other people don't. But in terms of price point, I think 649 for a 1 watt amp is absolutely insane. Why would anyone buy that new for 649 at only 1 watt? I mean, don't get me wrong. 1 watt can sound incredibly full and saturated and everything else. But at the price point in this economy, I couldn't imagine anyone in the right mind paying $649 for a 1 watt tube, 1 watt tube head. No way. Quilter's been around for a long time. It just depends on, do you want more of a power block setup as opposed to a head? It's tough to really describe how the Quilters sound, just because it's way different than a lot of other solid state amps. It's just difficult to describe. If you're that type of person that doesn't want a elaborate, heavy, big head, with a name on it or whatever, Quilter, fantastic option. And the only catch is that at 200 watts, you're going to have a special cab or cabs to make sure that you can handle that much wattage. And that, that goes for anything that's a guitar, that's a power block or a power amp. Just like the Seymour Duncan power stage at 700 watts. Yeah, you're probably going to have to hook that up to a full stack. Anyway, moving on. 6505 MH by Peavey, great option, really solid. They, in this sense, this also uses the EL84s. I personally, like I've said before, I don't mind buying an amp like that if it uses the smaller tubes, because they're generally cheaper to find. Moving on. Paul Reed Smith. Paul Reed Smith is usually a fantastic build quality, amplifier brand, and the MT15 is the only real gripe that everyone has with it, is that the master volume is very sensitive. There's not much of a taper to it, so you can't go from bedroom level to living room level to stage level. It's more like it goes from quiet to insanely loud. Could be because of the output transformer, because of the 15 watt amp running 606 tubes. Who knows? But at the end of the day, now that we're looking at an amp that has the full size tubes, the 6L6s, it's not a bad idea to buy it brand new. The good thing about these is, if I remember right, this one does allow you to bias it from the rear. So if you're not, yeah, here it is. If it's, if you're not a guitar amp tech, no problem, because you can still bias it yourself, even as a newbie. You put new power tubes in, you buy yourself a multimeter with a bias probe, and you can do the adjustments yourself. which I personally really like. Next, the LBX series, you either like them or you don't. Again, in this case, with these tubes with these amps that use those small tubes, I would have no problem buying, um, the LBX S, for example, used. No problem, because I could find one for probably about 550, and if I need to replace the tubes, I still end up spending less than 749 plus tax. So not a big deal. The LBX2 though, I do want to let you guys know I've already did a video of this one. Um, it's you either like it or you don't. There's no in between here. The LBX2 has the green and blue channel only, so you don't get that full burn high gain. You get something that's more of a 80s saturation in terms of high gain. Moving on, Randall. I've already stated my thoughts on Randall overall. The RG series is actually really good. But it was only 6-7 years ago where you could get the RG 3003, which is a 300 watt amp, 300 watt version of this, for $699, and now the 100 watt is $789. So a lot. It just comes down to balancing the cost. Balancing the cost and the economy. Solid state, it's maintenance free, but at $700, you'd probably be better off with the Katana or the Blackstar Silverline for less money. I mean, what is that? $200 less. Marshall DSL, great amp. I had one. I don't think I ever made a metal demo of it, but it ended up being just not for me because I didn't like the Marshall tone. But it was super loud. I mean, it was insanely loud even at 10 watt setting. And the good thing about this one in particular is that it is cathode biased, meaning you do not have to change or adjust the bias when replacing the tubes. Marshall even verified that with me. I know I think I still have the email from them, because I wasn't sure about it when I originally got the head, the DSL20. I think it was like 3 years ago, and they did confirm you do not need to bias it when you change the tubes in it, which is good. But keep in mind, you still don't get that high gain modern American metal sound because it's a Marshall. So keep that in mind. If you're looking for a brutal metal, probably not going to be the best for you. Even with the boost, it kind of lacked. We already talked about the PV Invective, I think. Maybe not. If not, better off buying one open box or lightly used, because it does use the EL84 tubes, which are cheap enough where if you buy this used for $550, $600, and you have to put new power tubes in, it will still be, you still ended up spending less money than buying one new. But like I said, those are the only type of tube amps that I will ever recommend buying used, because the EL84 tubes are relatively inexpensive. Moving on, Hughes and Kettner, they're great amps. I personally just don't like them. I love their speaker cabs. They make great speaker cabs. Amps, they're okay. The Hughes and Kettner Black Spirit is a really good amp, but of course you need a certain cab that can handle the 200 watts. Okay, here's my thing now. The PRS Archon 50 watt, fantastic sounding amp. I mean, really, really good. Now, keep in mind, this picture shows the cab and the head, but it's only the head for $999. Awesome sound. Biggest problem I personally had with it is that after about 4 hours of playtime in a week, I actually ended up getting a burning smell. And then the next day, it didn't work at all. It turned on, but I could never get any sound out of it. I had an amp tech check it out, and I don't remember what he said it was burned in there. The tubes were okay. The fuses were okay. There was something that literally got melted in the board because everything is hanging upside down. And tube amps generate a lot of heat. Where does that heat go? Well, heat rises. And if everything's on top, where's all that heat going to go? It's going to go right to all the circuit boards, the control panels, and it's just going to overheat. And so that's a serious problem. You guys already know what I think of the Iconic. It's a mid-scooped, high-gain tube amp. It's a great amp. Um, I don't know for the life of me why anyone would go and buy an EVH Mark III 50 watt for $1,300 when you can get that an 80 watt for $1,000, under $1,000. Makes zero sense to me. And the funny thing is that a lot of people compare this to the Mark III or the Stealth 50 watt, and you really can't compare because they don't have the same voicings. The Stealth is a fantastic amp, but the biggest problem is it goes for $1,500, and even used is around $1,200. So at the end of the day, you buy a used $1,200 amp, and if you need new tubes for that, you just put yourself right back up to the same price, pretty close to the same price as a brand new one at $1,500. So why even bother go through the headache? It doesn't make sense. Better off just buying a brand new 5150 Iconic for less money, brand new tubes in it. It's biased from the factory. It makes sense. Engel MetalMaster, fantastic amp. Just comes down to, can you use the 20 watts? I believe, I want to double check something. I believe that they're using 6L6s or 6V6s. Oh, no, I was thinking of the Fireball. Okay, the MetalMaster does use the EL84s. So this is going to kind of put you in the same territory as the PV Invective MH, realistically. I mean, it's an Engel. Engel are great amps. But when it comes down to, if it came down to this or the PV Invective MH, I would pick the PV Invective MH for way less money because they're running the same tubes, the same amount of tubes. I think the PV Invective has one extra preamp tube over this. So, the PV Invective I think is still going to be a little louder. This is still a fantastic sounding amp, but at $1,000 for a 20 watt, I personally don't see the value when it uses the EL84s. So at the end of the day, I would have recommended the PRS Archon over everything if I didn't have that overheating issue. So aside from that, it just comes down to really what you're going to be using it for. Do you need it for a bedroom? Do you need it for the living room? Do you need it for a rehearsal? Or do you need it for stage? And that's how you kind of choose between a 1 watt or 5 watt amp or compared to a 80 watt amp.